Roosevelt transformed the Democratic Party from the party of racism and treason into a party which is committed to the promotion of the general welfare. Not that he was able to act with a sweep of the hand to install the general welfare, but he fought to establish the principle. And most important, he fought to establish the principle in the minds of the American citizens. See, we are not emperors. We cannot, with our wave of the hand, declare a principle and then impose it by our will on people. The way we convey a principle is as philosophers in action, who convince people that that principle is the way in which they ought to live and act. And when a people is aroused to act for that principle, then the great good comes. The great good does not, no man is a god. No man can decree by a wave of the hand and give the world something according to principle. What a man can do is what a man can do. An individual human being can develop and transmit ideas, utilize ideas, convey these ideas to others. The function of leadership is essentially that of a philosopher, which few politicians seem to understand. It is the philosopher who conveys and implants ideas in people, ideas of principle, like a scientist who conveys discoveries. It is the implanting of those ideas in the social process, the creation of political and other institutions around ideas, which mobilize humanity to do a great work.
Welcome to today's Memorial Day special meeting of the LaRouche organization for the Memorial Day weekend of Saturday, May 29th, 31st. Mr. LaRouche, as you heard, spoke about the concept of the politician as philosopher. A good example of that is Abraham Lincoln. And I want to refer to Abraham Lincoln's March 4th, 1861, first inaugural address, and specifically its conclusion, in which Lincoln confronted with the fact that almost 7 states, I believe, had already or were about to secede from the Union as he, in fact, came into office. He had to figure out a way to address the nation as a whole, including the states that had defected. He said this: "The mystic chords of memory, stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and hearth-stone, all over this broad land, will yet swell the chorus of the Union when again touched, as surely they will be, by the better angels of our nature." Today, we want to try to invoke various of those angels and refer to them and remember them. And to begin that process, we're going to first hear from Diane Sayer, the independent candidate for United States Senate for 2022, running against Chuck Schumer in the state of New York. Diane?
Yes, thank you very much, Dennis. So on this Memorial Day, what I thought would be important to reflect on is the idea that one thing those of us who did not die in battle should resolve to do is to create a world where there is no more war. We have, and the person I'm particularly going to talk about today, General Douglas MacArthur, was very clear on September 2nd, 1945, on the battleship USS Missouri, that once you have the ability to annihilate the entire human race with nuclear weapons, which were used unnecessarily in Japan, which was the emperor was already working out terms of a surrender through the Vatican, but this was done for the purpose of terror. But once you could wield that kind of destruction, as MacArthur warned, you had to find some other way to resolve differences among mankind. And he said that we needed a spiritual recrudescence, that we had to become morally better. Otherwise, we were going to bring about our own extermination. And we certainly are looking at that kind of danger today, actually, with people who clearly have not struggled to master the idea of what it means to actually be human and what we're responsible for in terms of the development of the universe. So I wanted to actually start by going back to, speaking of Lincoln, Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, who received the surrender of the Confederate soldiers at Appomattox. And he made a very deliberate point of allowing them to bear their weapons. Some of them they received even on horseback. He took a lot of grief for this. People said, how can you do that? They're defeated, they're despicable. And, the cause for which they fought certainly was not good, to say the least. They were tools of a British imperial game to divide the United States and to ensure this entire hemisphere would be nothing but a slavery banana republic. But they had fought with courage. Many of them were former classmates of the Union Army generals from West Points. Many of them had fought next to each other in various battles earlier. And Chamberlain, because of Lincoln's guidance, really, and Lincoln's conception of charity toward all, malice toward none, had this approach in receiving the surrender. And it turned out to be very important because Jeff Davis, the Confederate president, wanted to continue fighting and wanted to organize guerrilla warfare in the form of the Ku Klux Klan and others to continue a kind of guerrilla warfare against the Republic. But the opposition to that in the South largely came from these generals, including some like Pickett, and Longstreet, who both, in their own way, in some cases very explicit, Longstreet joined the Republican Party, contributed to building the nation and building the Union. And that is the kind of spirit when you act on the faith that there is a quality of goodness even in your adversary, that you have a potential to bring that forward and to resolve the conflict on a higher level. So what you had with General Douglas MacArthur, when Japan surrendered, the first thing that he did which was extremely controversial, is he decided to make his landing with his small entourage at Atsugi Air Base and Naval Base, which people said was crazy because you still had kamikaze fighters. You had 300,000 well-trained Japanese soldiers who had been based there, and he was planning to land with his small delegation and not bear weapons going in. And when people challenged him and questioned him, he said, I know the Japanese people. His father had been stationed in Japan earlier, 2 generations basically earlier. And in fact, MacArthur, in one of his speeches on the Missouri, referred to Commodore Perry. So he clearly knew the strand of a certain resonance with the American system, I'll put it that way, not just the American system of economics, but a certain American form of government, which you'd seen. And it's not what's American, I'll just say, is universal ideas expressed in our Declaration of Independence, which had informed the Meiji Restoration. So that's what MacArthur was very consciously appealing to in the Japanese people. And what he said there, the entire speech, and it amazed, there's a long article he quotes from a fellow named Toshikazu Kazi, who was part of the diplomatic entourage in the surrender and who had been a student at Amherst and Harvard. And I'll read you a little bit about what he had to say about MacArthur. But this is just from the speech that MacArthur gives. And you realize this is a huge momentous occasion. And MacArthur does it in 8 minutes. Again, not to humiliate, to say something profound that gives the possibility of goodness. He says, "It is my earnest hope, and indeed the hope of all mankind, that from this solemn occasion a better world shall emerge out of the blood and carnage of the past, a world founded upon faith and understanding, a world dedicated to the dignity of man and the fulfillment of his most cherished wish for freedom, tolerance, and justice." So that was his theme. And MacArthur himself describes, actually, when he was given the command of the occupying power, how gut-wrenched he was, because every occupation he'd ever known in history had either been a disaster, it was too harsh and provoked an insurrection or rebellion, or it was too soft and didn't succeed in creating the conditions for a new form of government. He was very well aware of what Japan had fallen into, which he called a feudal system with tens of thousands of political prisoners. He moved to give women the right to vote. He was very concerned that the trials for war crimes, he didn't want to overdo it, but he also knew that a certain justice had to be imposed. When it was proposed that the emperor should be executed, MacArthur vehemently opposed this and said, if we do this, this is a real act to humiliate the Japanese people. And if you do it, we're going to need, and I forget how many millions, 1 million or 2 million, some huge number of American soldiers. There'll be an insurrection. You'll never be able to get the place under control. And the emperor turned out actually to be a very important collaborator of MacArthur. This diplomat who I referenced earlier describes MacArthur in this way. He says, "When the Supreme Commander finished, I wrote in my report the impression his words had made on me. He is a man of peace. Never has the truth of the line, 'Peace has her victories no less renowned than war,' been more eloquently demonstrated. He is a man of light. Radiantly, the gathering rays of his magnanimous soul embrace the earth, his footsteps paving the world with light. Is it not a piece of rare and good fortune, I asked myself, that a man of such caliber and character should have been designated as the supreme commander who will shape the destiny of Japan? In the dark hour of our despair and distress, a bright light is ushered in the very person of General MacArthur." So this is what, and this diplomat had written as they drove out and through Japan to the dock, and then went on boat 18 miles out to sea to the Missouri for the surrender. He said that he just was seized by this incredible grief and despair of seeing both the physical destruction of Japan and also being conscious, I think, from reading this, of how Japan had become fascist. And this is also something very interesting. I think you have to presume that truth exists in the hearts of men, that people know if they're in a regime which is fascist, which is destructive of the dignity of man. And therefore, regardless of whether people fought for it willfully, willingly, or not, and many probably did not. And as I said, they had many political prisoners at the time whom MacArthur got out of prison. This was known, and therefore someone standing for justice, what was needed was justice. They didn't need punishment. They needed justice and someone to uphold the principle of justice, which would then liberate people, the better angels of their nature, would liberate them to be good. And I think this is very, very important right now for Americans to reflect on, because our nation at the moment, we are behaving in a very ugly way. It is not reflective of the goodness of the qualities of the American Revolution. If you look at the shift from the 1960s, these assassinations and the Kennedys, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, the Vietnam War, the rock, drug, sex counterculture, and Earth Day, and then a shift. We had many wars. We've had nearly perpetual wars since then, and where people can make such statements as Madeleine Albright saying the death of 500,000 Iraqi children due to sanctions and bombing is a perfectly reasonable price to pay for getting rid of Saddam Hussein. I mean, the fact that anybody could say this is unbelievable, and that she wouldn't be immediately put in some mental asylum in the United States, or that Americans would be willing to go along with such statements. I think it's very important that we remember the giants who represented the actual principles by which our republic was founded, and what LaRouche was referencing, a sort of philosopher. So the last thing I want to say, because we really should dedicate ourselves this Memorial Day to the idea that in memory of all of those who have died in these wars, we are not going to have any more wars, that mankind is finally going to grow up. And MacArthur would agree vehemently, and I'm going to share with you the proof of that. He says here, it has frequently been charged, even by those who should be better informed, that the no war clause, he's working with Japan. They have to rewrite their constitution. They're developing a new constitution. And MacArthur's approach is hands off. He's not going to write this for them. It has to be theirs. They have to own it, so to speak. And I should just say, and not neglect, obviously, one very, very major component of the work that he did there was with collaborators of FDR who had died before the surrender, of course, but his collaborators in the US for the reconstruction of Japan to ensure sanitation, clean water, food, not to allow diseases to become pandemic, that kind of thing. And you'll hear the importance of that here. So he says that the no war clause in the Japanese constitution was forced upon the government by my personal fiat. This is not true, as the following facts will show. Long before work was completed on the new document by Dr. Matsumoto, I had an appointment with Prime Minister Shidehara, who wished to thank me for making what was then a new drug in Japan, penicillin, available in aiding his recovery from severe illness. He arrived at my office soon on January 24th and thanked me for the penicillin, but I noted that he seemed to be somewhat embarrassed and hesitant. I asked him what was troubling him, that as Prime Minister he could speak with the greatest frankness, either by way of complaint or suggestion. He replied that he hesitated to do so because of my profession as a soldier. I assured him soldiers were not as unresponsive or as inflexible as they are sometimes pictured, that at the bottom, most of them were quite human. He then proposed that when the new constitution became final, that it include the so-called no war clause. He also wanted to prohibit any military establishment for Japan, any military establishment whatsoever. Two things would thus be accomplished. The old military party would be deprived of any instrument through which they could someday seize power, and the rest of the world would know that Japan never intended to wage war again. He added that Japan was a poor country and could not really afford to pour money into armaments anyway. Whatever resources the nation had left should go toward bolstering the economy. I had thought that my long years of experience had rendered me practically immune to surprise or unusual excitement, but this took my breath away. I could not have agreed more. For years, I have believed that war should be abolished as an outmoded means of resolving disputes between nations. Probably no living man has seen as much of war and its destruction as I had. A participant or observer in 6 wars, a veteran of 20 campaigns, the survivor of hundreds of battlefields, I have fought with or against the soldiers of practically every country in the world, and my abhorrence reached its height with the perfection of the atom bomb. When I spoke in this vein, it was Shidehara's turn to be surprised. His amazement was so great that he seemed overwhelmed as he left the office. Tears ran down his face, and he turned back to me and said, "The world will laugh and mock us as impractical visionaries, but 100 years from now, we will be called prophets." And that's what I'd like to conclude with.
Thank you very much for that, Diane. On September 13th, 2010, Lyndon LaRouche released a paper that was entitled, "It Was No Conspiracy, MacArthur and Eisenhower." And he was referring to the 2 primary commanders of the American forces of World War II, General Douglas MacArthur, of which you've just heard from Diane, and General Dwight Eisenhower, who was the supreme commander of the Allied expeditionary forces in Europe. LaRouche's document began with the following reflection, which was featured by Jerry Rose in our fireside chat with Lyndon LaRouche this past Thursday.
Today, I am among the mere handful of those few still living veterans of a certain past military service who were part of what some people today would call mistakenly a conspiracy. Today, we few represent that handful of those veterans who today had lived through that awful morning when the news had come that our greatly beloved President Franklin Delano Roosevelt had died. Ours is simply the patriotism of those among us at that time who had reacted with a certain special devotion to that sense of patriotic mission to which we had been called during what was still then the ongoing Great Long War. That was, at first, no more than the silent oath to which I committed myself when the news of Franklin Roosevelt's death reached the few of us who would be gathered that evening in a military encampment at Kanchapara, Bengal, India. When we met quietly in the dusk of that evening, there, I replied to that group of fellow soldiers who came to me to ask me their question. My words from that past are carved in memory still today. We have been led, until now, by a great president who has now died. The new president is a little man, and I am afraid for our country now. One remembers things like that. The words I spoke in the quiet of that evening were to return to become my modest, continuing, silent personal commitment for the ensuing 3 decades of my life. Then, later, one day, another veteran touched my memories
After that, there was no need to ask why. The silent trumpet had called again. I was to experience now a renewed old and prolonged warfare, like ghosts from the same old opposing sides. Today I, for one, am still standing. Let my thought tonight seem to touch your shoulder, patriot, as someone long ago had seemed to touch my own. There was no conspiracy beyond doing one's duty, even still today, when a silent trumpet called those few old soldiers who never really die.
Diane has already invoked one of those old soldiers, Douglas MacArthur. With respect to General and then President Dwight Eisenhower, the most famous of Eisenhower's speeches has ironically become his farewell speech, which he delivered on January 17th, 1961.
We now stand 10 years past the midpoint of a century that has witnessed 4 major wars among great nations. 3 of these involved our own country. Despite these holocausts, America is today the strongest, the most influential, and most productive nation in the world. Understandably proud of this preeminence, we yet realize that America's leadership and prestige depend not merely upon our unmatched material progress, riches, and military strength, but on how we use our power in the interest of world peace and human betterment. Our military organization today bears little relation to that known of any of my predecessors in peacetime, or indeed by the fighting men of World War II or Korea. Until the latest of our world conflicts, the United States had no armaments industry. American makers of plowshares could, with time and as required, make swords as well. But we can no longer risk emergency improvisation of national defense. We have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions. Added to this, 3.5 million men and women are directly engaged in the defense establishment. We annually spend on military security alone more than the net income of all United States corporations. Now, this conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new in the American experience. The total influence, economic, political, even spiritual, is felt in every city, every state house, every office of the federal government. We recognize the imperative need for this development, yet we must not fail to comprehend its grave implications. Our toil, resources, and livelihood are all involved. So is the very structure of our society. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes. We should take nothing for granted. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals, so that security and liberty may prosper together.
The American combat veteran who would take office 3 days after that speech, John F. Kennedy, was well aware of this problem of the military-industrial complex. He was the first president born in the 20th century, as he often remarked. By the way, today is his birthday. He was born on May 29th, 1917. What we're going to do is to reference something that Kennedy did, which echoes back to what we were referring to in President Lincoln's first inaugural, the principle of the philosopher and the poet as politician. This is John Kennedy speaking a few weeks before his death on October 26th, 1963, at Amherst College in honor of the poet Robert Frost.
The problems which this country now faces are staggering, both at home and abroad. We need the service, in the great sense, of every educated man or woman to find 10 million jobs in the next 2.5 years, to govern our relations, a country which lived in isolation for 150 years and is now suddenly the leader of the free world, to govern our relations with over 100 countries, to govern those relations with success so that the balance of power remains strong on the side of freedom, to make it possible for Americans of all different races and creeds to live together in harmony, to make it possible for a world to exist in diversity and freedom. All this requires the best of all of us. And therefore, I am proud to come to this college, whose graduates have recognized this obligation, and to say to those who are now here that the need is endless, and I'm confident that you will respond. Robert Frost said it. Two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. I hope that road will not be the less traveled by, and I hope your commitment to the great public interest in the years to come will be worthy of your long inheritance since your beginning. This day, devoted to the memory of Robert Frost, offers an opportunity for reflection which is prized by politicians as well as by others, and even by poets. For Robert Frost was one of the granite figures of our time in America. He was supremely two things: an artist and an American. A nation reveals itself not only by the men it produces, but also by the men it honors, the men it remembers. In America, our heroes have customarily run to men of large accomplishments. But today, this college and country honors a man whose contribution was not to our size, but to our spirit, not to our political beliefs, but to our insight, not to our self-esteem, but to our self-comprehension. In honoring Robert Frost, we therefore can pay honor to the deepest sources of our national strength. That strength takes many forms, and the most obvious forms are not always the most significant. The men who create power make an indispensable contribution to the nation's greatness. But the men who question power make a contribution just as indispensable, especially when that questioning is disinterested. For they determine whether we use power or power uses us. Our national strength matters, but the spirit which informs and controls our strength matters just as much. This was the special significance of Robert Frost. He brought an unsparing instinct for reality to bear on the platitudes and pieties of society. His sense of the human tragedy fortified him against self-deception and easy consolation. I have been, he wrote, one acquainted with the night. And because he knew the midnight as well as the high noon, because he understood the ordeal as well as the triumph of the human spirit, he gave his age strength with which to overcome despair. At bottom, he held a deep faith in the spirit of man. And it's hardly an accident that Robert Frost coupled poetry and power, for he saw poetry as the means of saving power from itself. When power leads man towards arrogance, poetry reminds him of his limitations. When power narrows the areas of man's concern, poetry reminds him of the richness and diversity of his existence. When power corrupts, poetry cleanses. For art establishes the basic human truth, which must serve as the touchstone of our judgment. The artist, however faithful to his personal vision of reality, becomes the last champion of the individual mind and sensibility against an intrusive society and an officious state. The great artist is thus a solitary figure. He has, as Frost said, a lover's quarrel with the world. In pursuing his perceptions of reality, he must often sail against the currents of his time. This is not a popular role. If Robert Frost was much honored during his lifetime, it was because a good many preferred to ignore his darker truths. Yet, in retrospect, we see how the artist's fidelity has strengthened the fiber of our national life. If sometimes our great artists have been the most critical of our society, it is because their sensitivity and their concern for justice, which must motivate any true artist, makes him aware that our nation falls short of its highest potential. I see little of more importance to the future of our country and our civilization than full recognition of the place of the artist.
Recognition of that idea was not something that was merely characteristic of Americans at that time who were veterans of that war, the Second World War, but it was also true of people from around the world. One of them, Dag Hammarskjöld, who was appointed to be the United Nations Secretary General, the second one in its history, in 1953, was only 47 years old when he died in the middle of a mission involving Congo. He died in Ndola, Zambia, and he died 2 days before John Kennedy took office. And the day before, the day after Dag Hammarskjöld's death, Patrice Lumumba of Congo was assassinated. He was 36 years old and one of, I think, 5 or 6 college graduates who were African college graduates, Black African college graduates from Congo. So that when it was the case that at the time that Kennedy came into office, persons with whom he intended to work were no longer there for him to work with them.
I bring to this task a firm will to devote myself without any reserve to the work carried out by the United Nations organization in pursuit of its high aims. I am here to serve you all. In so doing, I shall count on your understanding, on your advice, and on your will to give to what I have to say the attention that it may deserve. I am animated by a desire to meet all problems with an open mind. It is for you to judge how I succeed. It is for you to correct me if I fail. My work shall be guided by this knowledge. This great organization grew out of the pain and turmoil of the last war. It welded together in what should be a continued cooperation for world peace all those who had fought against oppression. By all who have sacrificed themselves, by all sacrificing themselves in the fight for freedom and peace, this organization has, in the words of one of the great leaders of democracy, been consecrated far above our poor power to add or detract. May I quote also these other words from the Gettysburg Address. The world will little note, nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did. It is for us, the living, to be dedicated here to the unfinished task which they have, thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us. In concluding, may I remind you of the great memory just celebrated by the Christian world. May I do so because of what that memory tells us of the redeeming power of true dedication to peace and goodwill toward men. But common to us all, and above all other convictions, stands the truth once expressed by a Swedish poet when he said that the greatest prayer of man does not ask for victory, but for peace. I have not gone into any of the specific problems facing this organization, some of them now harassing all minds. But I have tried to indicate the spirit in which I shall go to the work when called upon to take part in the efforts of the United Nations organization to justify the hopes of all its members.
And that was Dag Hammarskjöld speaking at his inaugural speech at the United Nations in 1953. Lincoln's poetic approach to policy was the road less traveled that President John F. Kennedy chose, and it did make all the difference. 2 days in June of 1963 indicate that most strongly. On June 10th, 1963, in a speech at American University, President Kennedy indicated his dream for world peace. And then the next day, he did something else. First, we're going to view a portion of his remarks at American University.
I have therefore chosen this time and place to discuss a topic on which ignorance too often abounds and the truth too rarely perceived, and that is the most important topic on earth, peace. What kind of a peace do I mean, and what kind of a peace do we seek? Not a Pax Americana, enforced on the world by American weapons of war, not the peace of the grave or the security of the slave. I am talking about genuine peace, the kind of peace that makes life on earth worth living, the kind that enables men and nations to grow and to hope and build a better life for their children. Not merely peace for Americans, but peace for all men and women. Not merely peace in our time, but peace in all time. I speak of peace, therefore, as the necessary, rational end of rational men. I realize the pursuit of peace is not as dramatic as the pursuit of war, and frequently the words of the pursuers fall on deaf ears, but we have no more urgent task. First, examine our attitude towards peace itself. Too many of us think it is impossible. Too many think it is unreal. But that is a dangerous, defeatist belief. It leads to the conclusion that war is inevitable, that mankind is doomed, that we are gripped by forces we cannot control. We need not accept that view. Our problems are man-made, therefore they can be solved by man, and man can be as big as he wants. No problem of human destiny is beyond human beings. Man's reason and spirit have often solved the seemingly unsolvable, and we believe they can do it again. So let us persevere. Peace need not be impractical, and war need not be inevitable. By defining our goal more clearly, by making it seem more manageable and less remote, we can help all people to see it, to draw hope from it, and to move irresistibly towards it. No government or social system is so evil that its people must be considered as lacking in virtue. As Americans, we find communism profoundly repugnant as a negation of personal freedom and dignity. But we can still hail the Russian people for their many achievements in science and space, in economic and industrial growth, in culture, in acts of courage. Among the many traits the peoples of our two countries have in common, none is stronger than our mutual abhorrence of war. Almost unique among the major world powers, we have never been at war with each other, and no nation in the history of battle ever suffered more than the Soviet Union in the Second World War. At least 20 million lost their lives. So let us not be blind to our differences, but let us also direct attention to our common interests and the means by which those differences can be resolved. And if we cannot end now our differences, at least we can help make the world safe for diversity. For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's futures, and we are all mortal.
This was John F. Kennedy making policy in the macrocosm, policy toward all mankind as a species. But can one take that same approach and apply it to policy in the microcosm, to the individual cases of human rights? Well, the day after that speech, John Kennedy did precisely that when he delivered his Civil Rights Bill speech of June 11th, 1963.
We preach freedom around the world, and we mean it. And we cherish our freedom here at home. But are we to say to the world, and much more importantly, to each other, that this is a land of the free, except for the Negroes? That we have no second-class citizens, except Negroes? That we have no class or caste system, no ghettos, no master race, except with respect to Negroes? Now the time has come for this nation to fulfill its promise. The events in Birmingham and elsewhere have so increased the cries for equality that no city or state or legislative body can prudently choose to ignore them. The fires of frustration and discord are burning in every city, north and south. Where legal remedies are not at hand, redress is sought in the streets, in demonstrations, parades, and protests, which create tensions and threaten violence and threaten lives. We face, therefore, a moral crisis as a country and a people. It cannot be met by repressive police action. It cannot be left to increase demonstrations in the streets. It cannot be quieted by token moves or talk. It is a time to act in the Congress, in your state and local legislative body, and above all, in all of our daily lives. It is not enough to pin the blame on others, to say this is a problem of one section of the country or another, or deplore the facts that we face. A great change is at hand, and our task, our obligation, is to make that revolution, that change, peaceful and constructive for all.
Politics as art. That was the dedication of this earlier generation of Americans, veterans of the Second World War. 40 years after that Kennedy speech, Lyndon LaRouche, addressing an international audience of the Schiller Institute, and specifically a Russian portion of that audience, carried this vision that Kennedy had enunciated to a new level.
There are some practical considerations in this, strategic ones. And you will see that the two focal points of this conference will turn out to be at the end as they are at the beginning. The issue of Eurasian recovery, Eurasian development as the pivot for world recovery, including the role of Russia as a very special part of any such recovery effort, and the relationship of this Eurasian commitment to the contrasting situation of Africa. In other words, to understand the world as a whole in the simplest terms of reference, look at the possibility of what we can do in Eurasia, and then look at the needs of Africa in order to see humanity in its wholeness. Those who have the means to lift themselves up, and those on whose behalf, in the larger term, they must act to lift them up too. Because the idea of the general welfare, while it's a notion of government of each nation, also must be a notion of the relationships among nations of the world. We must find a community of principle in the notion of the general welfare to unite nations for a common good. The common good is the general welfare of the nations, of the people in each, and of the community of nations as a group. It's the only chance for this planet. And in order to make this work, as has been understood for more than a century, almost a century and a half now, the only way this could be worked was to develop a system of infrastructural development which would effectively link the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean across Eurasia. Now this is not railroads, this is not Silk Roads, these are corridors of development, corridors which run a range of, say, 100 kilometers in width, up to 100 kilometers, from the Atlantic to the Pacific, going in various directions, north, south, and so forth. Along these routes, as we did in the United States with the Transcontinental Railroad, that the area on either side of the transportation axis becomes immediately in and of itself a sustainable area of economic development. Then by that means you can branch out from the main corridors into subsidiary corridors of development and capture the area. If we make that kind of link, you have one interesting change occurs immediately. For as long as we know, mankind's economy has been dominated by the oceans. Contrary to all these theories that the British biblical archaeologists tell you, civilization did not come from inland and march down the rivers to the seas. It went the other way. Everything we know, especially the information on the internal characteristics of ancient astronomical calendars, shows that these astronomical calendars were predominantly the calendars used by a transoceanic maritime culture functioning a long period of time when most of North Eurasia was under a giant glacier for about 100,000 years. And during that period, most of what became later civilization was running around the oceans. And from the time that these maritime cultures came back into Eurasia, following the melting of the glacier about 20,000 years ago, when that began, was to move inland. And the first directions were to move along the great riverways inland, to move along the coastways, close to the seas and close to the maritime traffic. And if you look at the map of the world, you'll find the characteristic of development, or non-development, is the lack of the ability to utilize efficiently the inland areas, the landlocked areas of the world, with the same degree of efficiency and productivity we can use the coastal areas and the chief riverways. So therefore, if you look in Central Asia, what do you see? You see, here's the heart of it. In China, you have a coastal area of China which reflects this, which is more highly developed, relatively speaking, and inland, the area is poorly developed, the population has a poorer standard of living, poor opportunities for development. This extends then into Central and North Asia as a whole. Therefore, if we conquer this area, what happens? Take a transportation alone. People will think today, who don't think, will think that ocean freight is the cheapest way to move freight. It's not true. The cheapest way to move freight is across land, not by truck. Trucks running up and down the highway tell you that the economy is being mismanaged. Too many trucks. It's not efficient. Costs too much. intrinsically bad. Railways are much better. Integrated transport systems featuring railways, especially magnetic levitation systems, are excellent. Magnetic levitation systems move passengers more rapidly, but magnetic levitation systems for moving cargo, for freight, that is really a wonder. That's where the payoff comes. If you can move freight from Rotterdam to Tokyo at an average rate of 300 kilometers per hour without much stopping along the way, and if for every 100 kilometers of motion across that route you are generating the creation of wealth through production as a result of the existence of that corridor, then the cost of moving freight from Rotterdam to Tokyo is less than zero and can be up to 200 to 300 kilometers per hour. Now, what ocean freight system can do that? Did you ever see a large supercargo ship producing wealth while it was traveling across the ocean? And at what speed? So therefore, we've come to a turning point in technology, which has emerged over recent periods, where the development of the internal landmass of the world and the great typical frontier is Central and North Asia. It's the greatest opportunity, single opportunity, before all mankind for development. Now this requires some revolutionary changes in the way we think about things. This means that we would be engaged in the greatest change in the environment in the history of mankind. This single project, say a 25-year or more, development of Central and North Asia in this direction, including the conquest of the tundra. The Arctic tundra is one of the great frontiers to be mastered. It can be done. Would mean a great change in the environment. Now, how are we going to decide what is good and bad about changing the environment? Well, what people think today about the environment is pretty stupid. It's wrong. It doesn't make any sense. They don't know what they're talking about. And you see the kind of education you get, it's no wonder they believe that nonsense. Especially people with physics degrees who don't know which end is up. But the great theory of the environment was established by a Russian of Ukrainian credentials, Vladimir Vernadsky, with his concept of geobiochemistry. See, what you're taught, the problem here is you're taught in most universities and elsewhere about science is nonsense. It's a damn lie, most of it, to put it frankly. What you're taught as basic physics is mostly a lie. Because we know from, as Vernadsky demonstrated this in his own way, and others have known it and shown it, that there are actually three principles involved in man's physical relationship to the earth and the universe. Three categories. One, the category we call non-living processes. What most people who aren't well educated call physical processes. Yeah? The second one, which some people don't understand, those in molecular biology, they refuse to understand it. It's called the principle of life. You will never get life out of a non-living process. Life is, as Pasteur insisted, is a principle unto itself. But how it's a universal physical principle, which, as Vernadsky demonstrated with his biogeochemistry, is that the history of Earth is what? The oceans and the atmosphere were produced by living processes. Down several kilometers in the Earth's surface, most of the Earth that we are in touch with as humanity was created as a byproduct of living processes. What Vernadsky calls the natural products of the biosphere. We can measure it. We can measure the power of the biosphere over the non-living process. We can measure it. Living processes are superior to non-living processes. They're more powerful. They're apparently weak, but their long-term effects are more powerful than the short-term effects of the non-living processes. Now there's a third thing, which again Kant won't let you know. Immanuel Kant. That's why they call him Kant, because he can't do anything. If you believe him, you can't do anything either. The essential nature of man is that we are capable of making discoveries of universal physical principles. Discoveries we can validate in known experimental ways. By applying these principles, we increase our power in the universe in ways that can be measured physically per capita and per square kilometer. We can measure this in terms of the demographic effect of this kind of action. That is, does the human species improve its life expectancy, its power to exist in the universe as a result of this? Yes, it does. That's good. Mankind actually is primary mastery of nature has occurred in terms of man's mastery and development of the biosphere. So actually, the biosphere is including what we call basic economic infrastructure, such as waterways, power systems, transportation systems. These are part of the development of cities, of good cities at least. These are natural products of cognition which are reflected as improvements in the biosphere. The biosphere is weak. It is stupid. It does not know how to deal with the deserts it has. It does not know how to deal with the tundras. It does not know how to deal with other problems that it has. But we as human beings can come to our poor, stupid slave, the biosphere, and say, we will educate you and we will make you stronger and better. So mankind intervenes in the biosphere to make the biosphere better. And so the principles of discovery, the application or discovery of principles applied to the environment creates the natural products of cognition in the biosphere, which improves the biosphere, which increases the potential for human life. So this is not a mysterious, arbitrary area. This is an area of science. It's an area of scientific precision, which would mean that the job to do is not to say, is it good or bad to tamper with the environment? It's very good to tamper with the environment if you know what you're doing. But you have to develop the science of water management, the science of transportation, the science of reforestation, the science of how to change and control the atmosphere and the climate. And that's what you can't make big mistakes. These mistakes will live with you for a quarter century or longer. You can't make big mistakes. Therefore, you have to have competent people, competent groups of people making the determination of how we do this. But by changing the biosphere of Central and North Asia, and changing the biosphere in the arid areas of China and so forth, we will create the greatest boon for humanity in any part of this planet. What we need is a task-oriented mission task force to undertake the policy planning for precisely this, and it must be international.
Now, the unfinished task left after the Second World War is best seen by the idea of creating a World Health Platform that brings to fruition the true vision of those veterans to stop the wanton and arbitrary loss of human life throughout the planet. There's an appreciation of the idea of what these veterans represented in countries such as Russia, with its Immortal Regiment ceremony that happens every year. And it's greater than that in the United States, where people often use the phrase, thank you for your service, but they don't necessarily want to perform the service, the true service, which was that which MacArthur and Kennedy and Eisenhower and Lyndon LaRouche have spoken to you about today. Because the development of the internal land masses of the world would provide a new era in human and planetary evolution, this requires a massive increase in energy flux density in every economy in the world. It requires a shocking revolution in our ideas of science, And it requires perhaps an even more shocking revolution in our treatment of one another on the planet. And it's that which we would best remember this Memorial Day weekend. So, Diane, I'd like to go back to you and ask for any comments you have as to what you've seen and your own responses to this day, this weekend, and this task.
Thanks. Well, I would like to encourage everybody to think about President Kennedy's words about the poet and the purpose of art, and encourage everyone. We are having an extension of the Beethoven 250-year anniversary because of the pandemic, and really because people need it. I don't think we all think like Beethoven yet. So to take some time this weekend and immerse yourself in something beautiful and reflect on what it means to be human and on that debt that we owe those people who gave their lives willingly in order that mankind might get to the spiritual recrudescence that Douglas MacArthur is speaking about. And I think that it's there. I'll just say that I believe very much as MacArthur believed, with not evidence before him, but in his mind, what he knew of the people of Japan. We have reason to have that faith about the rest of the human race, that quality of goodness can be evoked. And I would just say that Americans might do well to reflect a little bit on what China is doing in the world. There was just a volcano that erupted in Congo. The town or city of Goma has been devastated by the volcano and the earthquakes accompanying it. You know that President Lincoln, Franklin Roosevelt, President Kennedy would be there, in effect. The United States would be doing that. Nowadays, we have heard next to nothing about it. Instead of aiding India or Argentina, we are hoarding vaccines. China, meanwhile, and even India, and people are accusing India of being stupid for having exported so many vaccines when now they are being hit by the pandemic. But this is what actually civilized nations do. This is how they conduct themselves. It's not vaccine diplomacy. It's not a manipulation to get some other good. It's not you scratch my back and I scratch yours, but it's a commitment to a higher principle of humanity, and also a recognition that actually the truth of the universe is what Martin Luther King said, that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. And it is the case that not only should we do unto others what we would have done unto ourselves, but we will discover that the universe is so constructed that that is exactly what happens. So those are my comments.
Okay, very good. And so that will conclude our Memorial Day special report. 4 weeks from today, there will be a conference sponsored by the Schiller Institute, and that will be happening for Saturday and Sunday, a 4-panel conference. More details will be available shortly at this location and also at the Schiller Institute website. And while the particular title for that conference has not yet been assigned, the mission of the conference is to establish, if you will, in a fighting way, the proposition that there are no limits to growth. Why human beings are the primary, evolving, and permanent natural resource for the universe as a whole. So we want to thank you for joining us. Have a productive and insightful Memorial Day weekend, and we'll see you here next week.